Thank you. All right, you ready to start? We're going to start whether you're ready or not. The question for this semester in this course is this one right here. What is law? You might think it's a rather simple question, but if you were to assume that, you would very soon be disappointed. We're going to discover that the question, what is law, is actually a very difficult and complicated question. Or more precisely, the answer to that question is complicated. Now we're going to begin today answering this question using a method of inquiry, named after Socrates, one of the people you read about for today's class. This method is known as the Socratic Method. It consists of me asking you questions and you answering the questions, and then me telling you why your answers are wrong and asking you more questions, all right? So don't get frustrated with yourself. This is how it works.
This class took place during the global coronavirus pandemic in the year 2020. The students were all wearing masks as they came into class. This provided a useful object lesson on the power and efficacy of law.
All right, let's pause there for a moment. Let's reflect on what we've been doing the first 15 minutes of class here. What have I been doing? I've been asking you questions. Why have I been asking you questions? My purpose in asking those questions was to know the answer, right? I wanted to know, are you wearing a mask, and why are you wearing a mask? And notice, I didn't have to explain myself to you. You knew what to do in response to my questions. You knew what I was after, didn't you? You understood that I was seeking answers, and you provided those answers. So the first thing we can notice about what we've been doing here so far is that we all understand what we're doing by reference to a common end or a common goal. Let's for now call it a common good. And that is intelligible by reference to the activity that we've been engaged in. I've been involved in asking questions, call it inquiry. And the point of asking questions or inquiry was relatively obvious to you. You understood that what I was after was knowledge. I wanted to know, what is the case? Are you wearing a mask, and why are you wearing a mask? So the point of our exercise, you immediately grasped, and you entered into the exercise with me, didn't you? Those of you I called on started answering questions. You knew what to do, didn't you? You knew that what I was after was knowledge about something. Then the next question is, what is knowledge? Why is it valuable? Why should I care to know about your masks and your reasons for wearing them? When I asked you about your masks and your reason for wearing them, I sought to know something about reality. What is the case? What is actually the case? I wanted honest answers from you, and you gave them. And the answers were intelligible to us all insofar as they conform to reality. What do I mean by that? Well, if I had asked, are you wearing a mask, while you have a mask on your face, and you replied, no, I'm not wearing a mask, would we have accepted that answer as a correct answer? No, we would have either rejected your answer, or we would have wanted answers to more questions, because it looks an awful lot like you're wearing a mask, doesn't it? Or suppose I had asked you, why are you wearing a mask? And you had told me, well, I was born with a mask on. Right? I was born this way. Would you accept that as reality? Probably not. We would have more questions, wouldn't we? So it's not enough that we have knowledge. We want knowledge to conform to something called reality. And when knowledge conforms to reality, we call that truth. The point of asking questions, of inquiring, is to acquire knowledge. And knowledge satisfies when it conforms to reality. That is, when it is knowledge of what is true. Okay, so that's the first thing to notice. We're after knowledge of what is true. But we're not after knowledge of what is true in a sort of general abstract sense. This is law school. What we're after is knowledge of what is true about the law. This is our question. What is law? We want to know the truth about what law is. All right? Now things get a bit complicated. Because knowledge of truth comes in two different modes or forms. We ask why because we want to know what is true. We want our knowledge of law also to conform to reality about law so that we can practice law well. In other words, we want to know the truth about law. But when we inquire about law, we find that there is not just one reality about law to discover. This thing that we call law turns out to be two different things. So consider, if I were to ask you, do you stop at red lights while driving your car? What are you all going to say? Whether or not you do, actually, in fact. You're all going to say, yes, of course, I stop at red lights, right? Yes, of course, I obey the speed limit. Suppose I were to then ask you, why do you stop at red lights? Many of you would probably give answers very similar to the ones I got when I asked why you're wearing a mask, right? I'd say, well, I was ordered to stop at the red light. Or, well, everybody does it. And so it makes sense for me to do it. Or, I don't want to get pulled over by the police. Or, if I run the red light, it's going to be an accident and I'm going to get hurt. Right? We can interrogate your reasons for stopping at red lights. What if I were to ask you, if you were to step off the roof of this building, what would happen? It's flat. Right? The answer is, gives us some knowledge of truth, you're going to fall. Yeah? That's the truth about what's going to happen if you step off the building. If I were to ask you, why would you fall? Is this how you would articulate your response? Well, I would fall because someone ordered me to fall, the governor. I would fall because everybody's doing it. I would fall because I wanted to get away from the police. No, of course not. Why are you going to fall? Gravity is why you're going to fall, right? In the first case, I'm asking about the reason why you stop at red lights, the reason why you wear a mask, the reason why you pay your taxes. And that answers to a particular kind of truth about what we call law. In the second case, I'm asking about the reason why you fall when you step off a roof. And that answers to a different kind of phenomenon that we also call law. And we need to separate these two. So let's begin by making it concrete. Here is a law that I just promulgated. You ready? A student earns 100 points and therefore an automatic A for the semester by raising his or her right hand and swearing the following oath. I've only got 3 takers so far. Oh, some more. Oh, okay, good. A few more. Automatic A for the semester. All you have to do is raise your right hand and swear the following oath. Okay, I got about half the class. Repeat after me. I do solemnly swear, affirm and attest, before God, under the pains and penalties of perjury, so far so good, and at risk of whatever punishment that the subject of my oath deems meet and just, in his absolute and exclusive discretion, that Professor Adam J. McLeod, Professor of Law, eminent knower of things, all wise teacher and perfect example, of virtue and right conduct
of virtue and right conduct
is, and at all times shall be,
is, and at all times shall be,
I'm sorry to lose people, guardian of my being, I've lost a few more people, master of my will, some of you are really hanging tough in there, and keeper of my soul. Got two left. I've got two people willing to sell me their soul for an A. I'm not going to finish the pledge for the sake of your souls. What's wrong with the pledge that I just asked you to take? I promulgated a law, didn't I? I made the command very clear, didn't I?
No.
Did I not?
No.
Could I have been clearer?
You didn't make the consequences clear.
I made the consequences very clear, I thought. You take the pledge, you get an A. Was anyone confused on that point? Did I tell you what the consequences would be? So I promulgated the law. Right? Is there any question that I am the authority in this classroom right now? Do we have any doubts about that? Let's just get that settled right now. Yeah. Right? So it looks like a pretty good law. So why did I only have two people in the end who were willing to finish the pledge? What was wrong with the rest of you?
You didn't know what you were asking us to agree to.
You're worried that there might be consequences beyond those which were contained in my law. What if I tell you that anyone who refuses to swear the oath may not attend any more classes and earns an F for the semester? Is that going to change your calculation at all? Nope. Some of you are still holding on to your soul. Some people say yes. They weren't willing to sell their soul for an automatic A, but they are willing to sell their soul to avoid an F. Okay, what's the difference? What's the difference between these three cases? The law of mask wearing, which you all chose to obey, the law of my pledge, which only two of you chose to obey, and the law of falling off buildings, call it the law of gravity, which happens whether or not you choose. Is there a law in each of these cases? Seems like there is, isn't there? And yet these are laws in very different senses, aren't they? So we need to get clear, a little bit clearer, on what we mean by law. Okay. How are we going to do that? Here's how we're going to do it. When we consider law in human society, the answer we get to the question why is complicated by the fact that human beings do not always act like rocks falling off cliffs. We cannot choose whether to obey the law of gravity. It just is. But we can choose not to obey traffic and taxation laws or mask-wearing laws. So it turns out that we mean law in at least two different ways. Sometimes we use the word law purely descriptively, to describe, as a general description of what is the case, some reality that we're trying to understand. That's the law of gravity, right? The law of thermodynamics, which yields laws governing the entropy of organic matter, which you're going to discover when you go splat on the sidewalk and die, right? And all of those laws give us knowledge of what happens when someone steps off a roof. So this kind of inquiry is aimed at what we'll call theoretical knowledge. And as we'll see, that's just a fancy term of art for what you've been doing in school ever since kindergarten. You've been doing theoretical knowledge pretty much since you were 5 years old. Hopefully most of you even before that. It's inquiry about what is real and true about the world and the universe and everything in it. Okay, that's theoretical inquiry, aimed at theoretical knowledge. What is the case? Descriptive. But at other times, we use the word law in a different way, not to describe what is the case, but to decide what to do or not to do. So for example, Antigone must decide whether to bury her brother. Yeah? She's not reasoning about what is the case. She's reasoning about what is to be done. And in her deliberations, she must take into account two different things that go by the name law. The first one is Creon's edict. The other she calls the law of God, whatever that means. We'll get into it. And these laws are in conflict with each other, aren't they? And so unlike gravity or entropy, these laws do not determine Antigone's actions automatically by themselves. She must choose. And this is why the study of law is complicated. Because human beings aren't rocks. Human beings have this radical power called free choice or free will. From Antigone's perspective, these laws direct her to what is called practical knowledge. Knowledge of what is to be done. What should I do? That's another fancy term of art. It just means something that's very familiar to you. Reasoning about what is to be done. When you ate your breakfast this morning, when you brushed your teeth, when you came to class, when you put on your mask, you were engaged in practical inquiry aimed at practical knowledge. Practical inquiry is aimed not at what is the case, but instead at what is to be done. So we can summarize it this way. Every moment of our lives, we're engaged in practical inquiry, trying to decide what we should do. So when we consider human law, here's why it's complicated. When we're considering human law as distinct from the laws of physics and chemistry, we meet a complication because human beings have this complication. They choose to act or not act for different motivations. We are agents of practical reason. We choose to act or not act, and we can choose to act for reasons. Once you chose to wear a mask today, for whatever reason, those reasons became your reasons. And I can ask about them. I can inquire as to why you're wearing a mask. And you can reveal your reasons to the rest of us. So consider again our question for this course. What is law? We ask this question because we want knowledge of law. And we acquired knowledge of law this afternoon by asking about your actions. I inquired why you're wearing masks, and the answers you gave to my question, why, yielded insights about the nature of law. The law factored into your decision to wear a mask as a matter of your practical reasoning, and then we all got together and did an exercise in theoretical reasoning about your practical reasoning. Right? Let's unpack that a little bit. What we're engaged in here, in this course, throughout law school, is theoretical reasoning about practical reasoning. We're trying to describe law. But law is a practical normative enterprise. So we need good description of prescriptive phenomena. You see? In law school, we're after a description of prescriptive laws. In other words, we're engaged in theoretical inquiry about practical inquiry. When you read the university's mask order and decided to put on a mask, you're engaged in practical reasoning. You're answering the question, what should I do? And the university's answer was prescriptive for some of you. Some of you didn't care. Some of you used different reasons to answer your practical question. I'm concerned about my health or the health of my parents. I'm worried about failing out of law school because I'm going to be sanctioned for not wearing a mask. Whatever your reasons. Now we're engaged in theoretical reasoning about your practical reasoning. We're all trying to be descriptive, trying to understand why you did or did not remove your mask when you came into class or put one on in the first place. And we do the same thing when we read cases in law school. What we're doing is looking at the way that people behave in the real world and asking, why did they behave that way? And what role did the law play in their practical reasoning? That's it. That's what law school is. 3 years of that. Okay? When we read the cases, we're trying to describe, theoretically, the practical reasoning of real people so that we can understand the law. Okay, so that's the second complication. First question is, what are we doing here? And we say we're after knowledge, and that knowledge has to conform to reality, else it's not going to be satisfying to us. The second question is, what kind of truth are we after? We said we're after a kind of truth about law, but law of a particular kind. Law that people take into account as they reason about what to do. And so we're engaged in a sort of descriptive enterprise about a normative enterprise. Here's the third complication. We find that there are different kinds of law which factor into people's practical reasoning. When we study law, we find that not all law is the same. Even if we just limit ourselves to prescriptive law and put science to one side. But don't put science to one side, because as we'll see this semester, we're going to meet some very, very influential thinkers, particularly in the American legal tradition, who are going to say, no, you need science to do law well, because law just is science. We'll come back to that. But for now, let's just bracket them and set them aside. Even if we're just doing prescriptive laws, we still need to know something about the different kinds or forms of law. Think about Antigone, right? It's a very simple divide. She's got not one, but two different laws. And she's got to figure out how they relate to each other if she's going to answer well the question, the practical question, should I bury my dead brother? Now, she's not the only one who finds law to be complicated. When civil rights protesters challenged institutionalized segregation right here in Montgomery, Alabama, a half century ago, both sides in the dispute claimed the authority of law. Segregationists pointed to real laws, statutes, regulations, judicial orders, which authorized and even required, in some cases, the separation of Southern citizens according to race. And they said those things are laws. Meanwhile, a civil rights leader named Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in a letter which we will read and discuss together in a couple of weeks, that the statutes, regulations, and orders were not laws as a matter of fact. He claimed that he was bound instead to obey a different law, something he called the natural law. We'll get to that. But he also insisted that he was obligated to sit in jail and accept the punishment for disobeying the statutes, regulations, and orders, which he acknowledged were in a different sense, nevertheless, laws. So, for though King did not think segregation rules were laws in one sense, he insisted that they were laws in a different sense. In other words, it's complicated. We've got to unpack it. You'll note, by the way, that people sitting in jail is a consistent theme of this course. Socrates, Antigone, Martin Luther King Jr., we'll meet another fellow named St. Paul, and they're all reflecting on the nature of law as they're sitting in prison, many times, at least 3 of those cases, awaiting their demise. So as Antigone's dilemma and King's letter from Birmingham jail both illustrate, the word law means different things. When we consider traffic laws, we're examining general rules, for example, which a legislature has promulgated, backed by some threat, usually of coercive sanction, and enforced by executive officials whom we call police officers. So consider this rule, which is up here on the screen. All persons are to drive no faster than the speed limit, and anyone who exceeds the speed limit shall pay a fine into the state treasury in an amount to be determined by the Secretary of the Department of Public Safety. This is a general directive to all members of the political community. The direction resembles a command. Don't speed. And it comes with a source of external motivation. If you do, the police will pull you over, and you're going to pay for it. Now, we encounter a very different meaning of law when we think about a contract. A contract is not a general rule. Legislatures do not enact them. Police officers do not enforce them. There's no general coercive threat looming in the event of disobedience. If you promise to make a ham sandwich for me, and I promise to pay you $5 in exchange for the ham sandwich, you now have an obligation, a legal obligation, to make the sandwich. And if you deliver the sandwich, I have an obligation a legal obligation to pay the $5. But the obligation is just between you and me. It's a personal obligation. Call it a private obligation or a private right. No one else is obligated to make a ham sandwich for me. Nevertheless, contracts are laws which impose obligations on the parties to the contract. Now, both of those senses of the word law, general rules and private laws, are quite different from the idea of law which we encounter in constitutions. Constitutional law is law, but it's not law in the same sense that a speed limit is a law, or a contract for a ham sandwich is a law. It's not a set of general commands promulgated by a legislature and backed by federal sanction. It's not a source of merely private right and duty. So if we read, for example, the Commerce Clause of Article 1, Section 8, that the Congress shall have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes, a provision that we'll take up in a few weeks here in this course. We're looking here at a law. But this is a law that interests not just two people like a contract, and it is a law which is not promulgated as a general rule backed by federal sanction like a traffic regulation. Instead, it's a source of power to govern. And remember, all three of those senses of law are quite radically different from the laws of science, gravity and thermodynamics and so forth. Okay, what do we do with this? At this point, we might just throw up our hands and say, well, the law can mean anything, right? Law is just made up. It's just a total fiction that we've just made up for particular purposes that might or might not correspond to reality. Maybe it's all made up. Maybe there's no reality to conform to. And we will meet some people this semester who've come to that conclusion. The law is completely conventional, completely made up, doesn't conform to any reality, it can mean anything we want. That's one thing we might say. We might say alternatively that it has a meaning, but it's the meaning that we together, by our customs and conventions, give to it. So we might all stipulate a meaning, for example, for the beginning of class. And it might be 1 o'clock p.m. or it might be 6 o'clock a.m. And the only reason we care about that stipulation is because you want to show up at the same time as everybody else. Else you're going to be here by yourself and not learn anything about the nature of law. So that might be what law is all about. It might be something that we stipulate to by convention to enable us to coordinate our actions. Or we might say that there is in fact one true objective meaning of the word law, and that all other meanings are simply confused, or less true, or not true. So Charles Dickens, for example, is the author of Tale of Two Cities. And someone else who pretends to be the author of Tale of Two Cities is not actually the author. There's a true author, and then there are false authors. We might say that about law. There are true laws, and there are false laws. The one thing we cannot say is that there's no answer to the question, what is law? Why? Because as people go about their practical reasoning, they keep giving answers about the law when you ask them, why are you doing that? So we need to know something about the answers that have been given to this question. In the time remaining, we're going to look at the answers given by two people in particular, a dude named Socrates and a chick named Antigone. And we're going to
For more understanding of law, rights, and each other, see my new book, The Age of Selfies, Reasoning About Rights When the Stakes Are Personal. And visit my website, www.adamjmcleod.com.